He looked a father in the eye and sneered that only important people deserved a place at the wedding, dismissing decades of sweat and sacrifice as if they were nothing. The insult dripped with arrogance, the kind that makes your blood boil. But the father didn't shout or beg. He simply smiled a cold and steady smile that meant retribution was already in motion. The kind of smile that said one man's empire was about to collapse in front of 150 witnesses. What happened next turned a perfect wedding into ashes. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. From March onward, the slow bleed of disrespect began, each cut carefully disguised as polite suggestion, each dismissal framed as refinement. The son's fiancée, swayed by her wealthy fiancé's whispers, agreed that the list of names her father had submitted looked too crowded, too common, too out of place for the glossy affair being planned. The father's lifelong friends, men who had once shared hard bread with him in break rooms, who had built foundations with him in blistering heat and freezing cold, were the first to go. They were men with rough hands and worn boots, men who would never blend into a ballroom shimmering with chandeliers. The fiancé's family smiled as they crossed those names out, their voices honeyed, their intentions venomous. To them, the measure of a man was not in his loyalty or labor, but in the cut of his suit and the polish of his surname. The father accepted the decision in silence, though inside it felt like someone had dragged a blade across his chest. He did not fight for his crew, those men who had carried steel beams with him, who had toasted him after each completed project with cheap beer and wide grins. He knew they would understand. They had always understood. But that didn't dull the sting. Each removal felt like an erasure of his life's work, as though sweat and scars could be dismissed by a flourish of an ink pen on fancy stationery. April brought more bloodletting this time, cloaked in softer words. The poker buddies from the old neighborhood vanished from the list. Men who had sat at his kitchen table every Thursday night for 30 years, dealing cards and sharing stories while his late wife made snacks from whatever leftovers she could scrape together. They weren't refined enough, he was told. They wouldn't understand the delicate etiquette expected of the Palmer family's circle. Even Mrs. Herrera, the woman who had watched his son grow up while he worked 18-hour days, was deemed too informal. She had braided his boy's hair when he was little, fed him tamales when the father worked double shifts to pay the mortgage, yet she was branded unworthy of witnessing the wedding. Each name that disappeared was not just a guest lost, but a piece of history ripped away, as though the past itself could be scrubbed clean. The father remained calm. He never raised his voice, never begged. He simply watched. He understood what was happening, even if his son didn't. He was being carved out of the narrative, one careful stroke at a time. By May, the fiancé suggested he consider upgrading his wardrobe for the pre-wedding events. A new suit from a family tailor, something more appropriate for mingling with senators and bankers. The father looked down at his calloused hands, at the scars etched by decades of building, and said nothing. He had worn the same suit for funerals, graduations, and milestones. It had seen grief and triumph. Now it was declared unfit for the company of people who claimed to move markets. The final insult came during a visit to the Westchester Country Club. The father had put down the deposit himself, money earned not from inheritance, but from bricks laid under the sun. When introduced to the planner, the fiancé smirked and said, "This is my future father-in-law. He's in construction, spitting the word out like sewage." What the boy didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that the father had built the very bones of that building. His company had renovated its east wing years ago, saving the project after another contractor walked away. Every polished board, every marble tile had passed through his oversight, but here he was treated like a laborer who had wandered into the wrong room. By June, the father's name was nowhere near the front tables. He was relegated to a corner near the kitchen doors, seated beside the clatter of plates and the smell of grease. It was a calculated humiliation, a reminder that he wasn't considered important enough to be seen, only tolerated. His late wife's photograph sat on the mantel at home, smiling warmly from a frame. Her absence now made heavier by the sneers of strangers who dared to dismiss everything they had built together. Still, he did not speak. His silence was deliberate, sharpened like a blade waiting for its moment. Every cut, every erasure, every smirk was fuel. What the fiancé's family didn't understand was that the man they were erasing had built more than houses and clubs. He had built networks, loyalty, and respect that money alone could not buy. His son squirmed during these conversations, looking down, shifting nervously, but never defending his father. The boy was blinded by love, or perhaps by the allure of prestige, believing that marrying into old money meant climbing into a new life. The father watched this with sorrow, but also with patience. He knew the truth would surface, that arrogance always carried a hidden rot. The deeper the exclusions went, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about seating charts or optics. It was about erasure, about taking a man who had clawed his way up from nothing and forcing him back into silence, back into the shadows. The father knew humiliation when he saw it, and he carried it quietly, letting it weigh in his chest until it became something colder, heavier, more dangerous. He spent nights alone, listening to the echo of his late wife's voice in the empty house, wondering what she would have said if she had seen her son's fiancé smirk across the kitchen table. She would have raised her chin, her eyes flashing with fire, and she would have told the boy exactly where to shove his invitations. The father wasn't her, but he remembered her strength, and he carried it like a hidden weapon. Each month brought another cut, another quiet insult disguised as refinement. By July, even his own brother's name had been questioned. A cardiologist who had saved lives for 20 years was apparently not established enough for the Palmers' society. That was when the father's patience hardened into resolve. He looked at his son's fiancé's family and saw not wealth but rot masquerading as gold. He saw a boy who strutted on borrowed feathers, a family drunk on the illusion of permanence, blind to the storm gathering in silence. The father didn't rage. He didn't plead. He simply smiled, that same cold smile he had given the fiancé in his living room. The smile that promised a reckoning was coming. Because every cut, every erasure, every humiliation was not just an insult. It was a miscalculation. And when the time came, those who dismissed him as unimportant would learn what kind of man they had tried to erase. They would discover that loyalty and respect are bricks stronger than any marble, and that when a builder decides to dismantle, he never leaves a single stone standing. The clock was ticking, and the storm was already forming. The father sat in silence, waiting for the day when those who believed themselves untouchable would finally understand what it meant to be powerless. And that day was closer than anyone could imagine. By the height of summer, the guest list had been stripped bare of everything that gave it meaning. Where once it had been filled with neighbors' work, friends, old companions who had shared decades of loyalty, it now gleamed with nothing but polished names, sterile and refined, curated like trophies on a shelf. The father watched as generations of connection were deleted line by line, the ink of erasure cold and deliberate. To the fiancé's family, refinement meant exclusion, meant reducing a man's life to something that could be quietly folded away in a back drawer. Every time a name vanished, it was as though his story was being unwritten in front of him, and the silence he maintained became heavier, more electric, like the stillness before a storm. What cut deepest was the absence of her. His late wife, the woman who had stood beside him when the business was only a dream, was never mentioned. Her memory had been reduced to a photograph left on the mantel at home, a picture that smiled at him when no one else would. She had once imagined sitting at their son's wedding, proud and glowing, seeing the future unfold. Now her presence was being erased, not with scissors or ink, but with disdain. Every dismissive nod from the Palmers seemed to say she had never existed, that her sacrifices, nights spent waiting up, years spent holding their home together, meant nothing in this new hierarchy of old money. He began to notice the subtle cues. When the fiancé's family spoke about the wedding, they never looked at him. Their eyes slid past him as if acknowledging his role would sully the narrative. He was reduced to a name on paperwork, a financial contributor, but not a father. They spoke about legacy and tradition while ignoring the very legacy that had made their event possible. It wasn't just his friends being pushed aside, it was his blood, his history, the woman who had built everything with him. Even the small details were stripped away. The idea of displaying family photos at the reception was dismissed as too personal. The suggestion of including a prayer his wife had loved was waved off as not fitting with the aesthetic. It wasn't just a wedding anymore, it was a stage, a theater for the Palmers to perform their importance. And in their play, he was cast as an extra someone to stand in the shadows and stay silent. But silence was never surrender. He carried it like a weapon, honed sharper with every slight. He sat at his kitchen table at night, staring at the guest list revisions, tracing the spaces where his life had once been. Each cut fueled the fire inside him. They thought they were erasing a man, but what they were really doing was building him into something harder, something they couldn't predict. His son's unease was obvious. The boy avoided his eyes, fumbling with words, letting the fiancé and her family speak for him. Once, after another adjustment to the list, the son mumbled something about compromise, about how these decisions weren't personal. The father stared at him, seeing not just a son, but a man who was slowly being reshaped into someone else's image. It broke his heart, but he stayed quiet. He knew lecturing would do nothing. What the boy needed was truth revealed, and truth always came no matter how hard people tried to bury it. The father began to notice patterns beyond the guest list. His son was dressed differently now. His shirts sharper, his shoes more expensive, his laughter tighter, rehearsed. He spoke less about work, about the pride of finishing projects, and more about optics, about appearances. The boy who had once followed him onto job sites, marveling at the way a building could rise from dirt and steel, was being trained to measure worth by last names and dinner invitations. That transformation was more painful than any exclusion. It was the slow theft of his own blood. When he walked through his home, he could feel his wife's absence more than ever. Her voice echoed in memory when he saw the stripped guest list, when he caught the condescending smiles of the Palmers. She would have never tolerated this, never allowed their son to bend so easily. He imagined her fury, her sharp words, her refusal to let any of this pass. But she was gone, and it was left to him to carry that fire. And he did, quietly, methodically, waiting. At one meeting, he overheard the Palmers discussing how the wedding would reflect their family's standing. His name was never spoken. It was as though the bride's father did not exist, as if the years of sacrifice that had brought his son to this moment had been a mere accident, a footnote unworthy of acknowledgement. He smiled politely as they spoke, but inside a promise was being written. Promises made in silence often carry the most weight. It was no longer just about being erased from a party. It was about erasure of identity, erasure of history, erasure of truth. And that he could not allow. The Palmers believed they were shaping the future, but they were blind to the foundation beneath them, blind to the fact that the man they were dismissing had built more than structures. He had built a network, an empire of trust favors, owed debts, unpaid alliances that stretched far beyond a seating chart. He looked at his son one night, the boy's face weary, caught between loyalty and ambition, and thought of the woman who had raised him with him. She deserved better than to see their child swallowed by arrogance. He deserved better than to be erased. And if his son was too blind to see it now, then he would make sure the truth was impossible to ignore later. So he waited. He listened. He gathered every insult like kindling, stacking it neatly in his mind. And though the Palmers believed they had buried him in silence, they had only given him room to sharpen his resolve. Because when the reckoning came, it would not be just about a wedding. It would be about reminding them that no one erases a man's life without consequence. And that consequence was already on its way. The tour of the country club was meant to impress a polished display of wealth and power, wrapped in polished floors and chandeliers that threw diamonds of light across the ceiling. The fiancé's family glided through the halls like royalty, shaking hands with managers who bowed too quickly, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. The father trailed behind his boots, silent on the marble he had once chosen himself, though no one in that room knew it. He could still remember the dust in the air years ago, the smell of plaster and fresh paint, the clang of steel beams as his men worked 12-hour shifts to meet deadlines no one thought possible. He had rebuilt this place from its bones, turned it from a failing property into the gem it was now. And yet when introductions came, the boy stood with his hand on his shoulder and said with a smirk, "This is my future father-in-law. He's just in construction." The words hung heavy, slicing through the air sharper than any blade. Just in construction. As though decades of labor, leadership, and sacrifice could be dismissed with a single flick of arrogance. The managers smiled politely, nodding as if they understood the hierarchy, but the father saw a flicker in their eyes, a flash of recognition. Some of them remembered. They had seen him here not as a guest, but as the man who had orchestrated the rebuild, who had demanded perfection, who had delivered under budget and ahead of schedule. Yet no one spoke. Silence in wealthy rooms was currency, and no one spent it lightly. The father didn't flinch. He simply looked around the glittering lobby, tracing the edges of the staircase he had fought to preserve, remembering the night he had argued with architects about the load-bearing walls while the clock ticked past midnight. He had stood on these very floors when they were raw concrete, had chosen the oak paneling that the boy now leaned against so casually. And now he was being presented as a laborer, as though his presence was an accident, a stray note in an otherwise polished symphony. Inside, he burned, but his face remained calm, his eyes sharp. He had learned long ago that silence unsettles the arrogant more than anger ever could. The boy laughed lightly, continuing his tour, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing beside him. The father's smile was faint, but it was the kind of smile that carried weight, the kind that marked beginnings rather than endings. As the group moved into the ballroom, the boy gestured at the gilded ceilings and said something about how perfect it would be for the first dance. The father tilted his head back, remembering the scaffolding that had filled this space, the sweat dripping from his brow as he climbed ladders to check details himself because he trusted no one else to get it right. He remembered the cracked foundation they had discovered under one wing, the crisis that could have collapsed the entire project. It was his decision, his risk, his sleepless nights that had saved the club. And now he was being told in so many words that he was unworthy of the space he had resurrected. He kept walking, every step a reminder that history cannot be erased no matter how hard the boy tried to paint over it. His career, his work was written into the walls of this place. The Palmers could polish it, claim it, boast of its beauty, but it was his hands, his mind, his men who had made it possible. The arrogance of pretending otherwise was almost laughable. Almost. The boy didn't notice the subtle looks. A manager's slight nod of respect when the father's eyes met his. A waiter's glance that lingered too long. Some people remembered. And that was enough. The truth had a way of lingering even in gilded halls where lies strutted with confidence. The tour ended on the balcony overlooking the golf course. The boy pointed out how beautiful the photos would be, his words dripping with smug pride. The father stepped to the railing, resting his calloused hands on the iron he had once approved in blueprint form. He looked out at the manicured lawns, but his mind saw the bulldozers, the piles of dirt, the men laboring under the sun to turn chaos into order. He stood in silence, letting the wind brush against his face, and in that moment he made a quiet vow. He would not argue. He would not correct the record. He would not demand respect. He would let them underestimate him, let them believe their own arrogance, let them think he was powerless. Because power wielded loudly dies quickly. Power wielded quietly endures until the moment it's unleashed. The boy smirked again, patting him on the shoulder like a child humoring an elder. "It's nice, right? You've probably never seen anything like this." The father turned to him, his eyes steady, and offered a small smile that froze the boy for half a second before he laughed it off. What the boy didn't realize was that in trying to belittle him, he had exposed his own weakness. The father now knew exactly how fragile this carefully constructed image was. He had seen the cracks in the facade, the overcompensating smirks, the desperate need to prove superiority. And cracks, no matter how small, always spread. When they left the club that evening, the father walked out beneath the carved archways, his pace steady, his silence intact. Behind him, the boy chatted on the phone, laughing too loudly, his voice echoing in the parking lot. The father's keys clicked in his hand, and for the first time in months, he felt a strange calm. He had been humiliated, erased, belittled, but he understood now. This wasn't just arrogance. This was fear disguised as confidence, insecurity masquerading as authority. And he knew something else too, something the boy would never expect. The foundation of this family's power, like the foundation of every building he had ever touched, could be broken. All it took was knowing where to strike. He slid behind the wheel of his truck, the same truck that had carried him to job sites for decades, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dusk, illuminating the road ahead. He didn't look back at the club. He didn't need to. His mark was already there in every beam and wall, in every detail the Palmers flaunted as their own. They had no idea that the man they tried to erase had built the very stage they stood on. And when the reckoning came, it wouldn't be loud or messy. It would be precise, exact, and devastating. Because the father knew better than anyone when a structure is rotten at its core, all it takes is one silent push to bring the whole thing down. It happened one evening in late July at a dinner arranged by the fiancé's family to finalize details for the rehearsal weekend. The restaurant was a cathedral of glass and steel, the kind of place where waiters glided like ghosts, and every plate looked like a painting. The father sat at the long table, his son beside him, and across from them, the Palmers commanded the conversation with the casual arrogance of people who had never been told no. They laughed loudly, ordered bottles of wine, without glancing at the prices, and treated the staff with the same distant politeness one gives to strangers passing on the street. The father ate little, listening as they dissected seating arrangements, menu options, and inevitably the guest list. It was then that the fiancé's mother leaned forward, adjusting her pearls as she scanned the sheet in her hand. "Now about your brother," she said lightly, almost as though discussing the weather. "He's a cardiologist, correct? At a community hospital." Her tone carried a trace of skepticism, a questioning edge that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The father nodded, once proud, despite the sting already rising in his chest. "Yes," he answered evenly, "for 20 years. He's saved more lives than I can count." The table went quiet for half a beat before the fiancé chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Of course that's respectable. But do you think he really fits here? This isn't exactly a crowd for local doctors. We're expecting senators, CEOs, people who've built real legacies." The father's fork stilled on his plate. The words were delivered with that polished sneer dressed up as sophistication, but poisoned with contempt. Local doctor. As if healing hearts and carrying families through the worst days of their lives were somehow less valuable than sitting in boardrooms or managing hedge funds. He glanced at his son, waiting for protest, for a flicker of anger, but the boy only shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on the tablecloth, lips pressed tight. Silence. Complicity by omission. In that silence, humiliation seeped in, heavy and suffocating. His brother had been his anchor for decades, the one who stood beside him when their parents died, who loaned him money when the business nearly collapsed, who had held his son at baptism with tears in his eyes. And now his life, his career was being reduced to a footnote, judged and dismissed by a boy who had never worked an honest day with his hands. The father felt his throat tighten, but he swallowed it down, forcing his face to remain calm, his eyes sharp. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing the wound. The conversation moved on, the Palmers shifting to talk of caterers and floral budgets, but the father's mind lingered. In that moment, something crystallized. It wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't just ignorance. It was the raw truth of who these people were. They didn't measure worth by character or sacrifice or love. They measured it by money, pedigree, and polish. To them, a man could build skyscrapers, heal hearts, or raise a family on his back, but if he didn't have the right connections, he was invisible. The father leaned back in his chair, letting the laughter of the Palmers wash over him. Their jokes were shallow, their smiles rehearsed, their eyes always darting, measuring, calculating who was worth their time. For the first time, he saw them clearly stripped of their glamour. They were not giants. They were children dressed in expensive clothes, terrified of being ordinary. And in that fear they lashed out, diminishing anyone who reminded them of the truth that legacies built on arrogance crumble faster than those built on sweat. When the dinner ended, he walked out into the night air, his son trailing behind. The boy mumbled something about compromise, about not making waves, about how the Palmers had a certain vision for the wedding. The father looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the conflict in his eyes. Love mixed with shame, ambition tangled with loyalty. The boy was caught in a net he didn't know how to escape. The father said nothing, only gave a short nod, but inside his resolve tightened. Later that night at his kitchen table, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at the framed photograph of his brother that sat on the shelf. He remembered the nights they had stayed up late as kids, whispering about their futures, promising to protect each other no matter what. He thought of the surgeries his brother had performed, the families who had clung to him in waiting rooms, the lives restored because of his steady hands. And now, this man's worth had been mocked in a single sentence. The father's jaw clenched, and he set the glass down with a heavy thud. Enough. From that point forward, humiliation transformed into clarity. He had been patient, had endured insult after insult, waiting, watching. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his family, his blood, the people who had stood by him when the Palmers were nothing more than strangers in a gated house. The father understood something. Then arrogance is never satisfied. If they could erase him, they would erase everyone connected to him. His wife, his brother, his friends. Entire histories could vanish beneath their polished smiles. He leaned back in his chair, the house dark around him, the weight of silence pressing down. But this time silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like strategy. It felt like the inhale before the strike. Because now he wasn't just preparing for revenge. He was preparing to defend something greater. His family's dignity, their honor, their very existence in the story. And as the night stretched on, the father's plan began to take shape. Every slight, every insult, every erasure would have its consequence. The Palmers thought they were untouchable, but he knew better. He had built enough structures to understand that the higher something climbs without a foundation, the harder it falls. And soon they would fall. He stood, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall. The house was quiet, his footsteps steady. On the mantel, his wife's photo caught the faint glow of the street lamp. Her smile frozen in time, her eyes fierce, even in stillness. He paused, staring at her face, and for the first time in months, he felt no shame, no sting of humiliation. Only resolve. The boy had shown his true character at that table, not just with words, but with the careless cruelty of a man who believed the world belonged to him. And the father knew without a shadow of doubt that soon, very soon, that belief would be shattered in the most public, devastating way imaginable. The day of the wedding arrived with all the precision of a military parade, every detail manicured to impress the cameras and the carefully chosen guest list. Cars lined the driveway of the country club, black sedans gleaming beneath the sun, chauffeurs waiting with stoic faces. The father walked through the entrance in a suit he had worn before the fabric pressed sharp, his shoes polished until they reflected the light. He had kept his silence, endured the slights, swallowed the humiliation that had been heaped on him over the past months. But this was different. This was public. This was a deliberate act of erasure performed on a stage built with his money. The usher smiled politely and guided him through the glittering ballroom past rows of white roses and crystal chandeliers that he had paid for, past tables dressed in linen, finer than anything he had ever owned, until he was led to a corner. The chair was tucked near the kitchen doors, where waiters bustled with trays of shrimp cocktails and steaming plates of chicken breast. Every time the door swung open, a blast of heat and clatter rushed out, the scent of grease overpowering the perfume of roses. This was his place between a stack of empty trays and a wheeled cart with a broken wheel that squeaked with every push. He sat down slowly, the weight of the insult pressing into his chest like a stone. From this vantage point he could see the chandeliers, could hear the music swell, could catch glimpses of his son's face as he laughed with the Palmers' guests. But he was not part of it. He was a shadow in the wings, a ghost in a hall he had built. His late wife's absence felt heavier than ever, her memory excluded, as deliberately as he had been. She should have been here, seated proudly at the front, watching the son they had raised. Instead, her presence had been erased just as he was being erased now. The rage boiled quietly, coiled in his stomach like a serpent waiting to strike. He clutched his small leather bag in his lap, his hands trembling at first before steadying with purpose. No one looked at him, not even his son, too busy adjusting his cufflinks, smiling for the photographers, basking in the glow of a family that wasn't his own. The fiancé's father stood tall, making toasts, his booming voice filling the room, while the father sat in the shadows, his ears ringing with every word. He thought of the nights he had worked double shifts, pouring every ounce of energy into paying for braces, for tuition, for the very roof over their heads. He thought of the decades he had sacrificed, the friends and family erased from this wedding, and the arrogance of being shoved into the corner like a burden. His humiliation had reached its peak, but he would not let them see it. His face remained calm, his smile faint, his body composed. Inside, however, something hardened. A line had been crossed. The waiter set a chipped plate in front of him, the food already cooling. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked down at the program resting beside the plate, elegant cursive on cream cardstock. His name wasn't there. His role in his son's life had been rewritten out of existence. The Palmers had claimed him as their puppet when money was needed, but now in front of their polished crowd he was invisible. The silence stretched around him, a silence filled with laughter that wasn't his, with music that didn't belong to him. But silence is deceptive. To those who don't listen, it looks like weakness. To those who understand it, is power sharpening itself. The father let the moment settle deep into his bones, each cheer and toast embedding itself like iron. He was not powerless. He had built the very foundation beneath their feet, had ties and loyalties they couldn't imagine, and money placed in places they didn't know existed. They had made a mistake, and he would teach them the cost of that mistake. He dabbed at the corner of his mouth with the napkin, pretending to remove a stain, though there was none. His eyes burned, but not from tears. It was from the fire building, the storm gathering in his chest. He glanced at the chandelier again, at his son, twirling the bride on the polished floor, and felt nothing but resolve. The world they thought they owned was about to collapse, and none of them knew it yet. He leaned back in his chair, his hands steady now, the faint hum of power vibrating through him like an engine starting after years of silence. Each insult had been a brick stacked carefully, and now the wall was complete. He had been quiet long enough. Quiet was over. As the music swelled and the crowd applauded, the father made his decision. The fiancé's fate was sealed. It would not be tonight, not here in front of strangers and photographers, but soon. Very soon. And when it came, it would be precise, devastating, and final. The waiter passed again, the squeak of the cart filling the air, but the father didn't hear it anymore. His mind was elsewhere, already shaping the reckoning. They thought he was just a man in the shadows, seated by the kitchen, forgotten and humiliated. But shadows move, and when they move, they swallow everything in their path. The father sat quietly watching, waiting, already writing the end of the story they thought they controlled. And that end would leave their perfect world in ruins. It was 2 days after the wedding when the father decided to act on the instinct that had been gnawing at him for months. He had watched the smirks, endured the insults, and sat silently through the polished theater the Palmers called dignity. But he knew arrogance that loud never stood alone. Arrogance that sharp was always armor, and armor was built to hide weakness. He called an old contact, a man who owed him favors from years back, when a construction deal had gone sideways, and the father's quiet intervention had saved him from ruin. That man was now a private investigator, gray-haired, meticulous with eyes that missed nothing. The father didn't waste words. He slid a photo of the fiancé across the table of a dimly lit diner and said only, "Find me the truth." The investigator nodded, slipped the photo into his jacket, and disappeared into the night. The father left without looking back. He had planted the seed, and now he waited. Days passed slowly, each one charged with the electric hum of expectation. He went about his work, kept his composure when neighbors asked about the wedding, even smiled when someone congratulated him on his son's good fortune. But inside, the storm was sharpening. He knew something was coming, and when it did, it would not be small. The call came a week later. The investigator's voice was low, deliberate, almost reluctant, as though what he had uncovered weighed heavily even on him. They met in a quiet office above a pawn shop, blinds drawn, the air thick with the smell of dust and old secrets. The investigator placed a thick envelope on the desk and slid it across. "He's not who he says he is," he said flatly. "Not even close." The father opened the file. Inside were bank records, casino receipts, loan documents signed under false pretenses. The fiancé was drowning in gambling debts that stretched across 3 states' debts to men who didn't send polite reminders, but broken bones. Worse still, there were transfers traced from the accounts of elderly clients, money siphoned slowly, carefully masked as investment fees and processing charges. The amounts weren't small, tens of thousands, hundreds, stolen from people who had trusted him with the savings of their lives. The father's hands did not shake as he turned page after page, but his chest tightened with each revelation. He had suspected arrogance was a mask, but he hadn't imagined rot this deep. The boy who dismissed his brother's career, who erased his wife's memory, who sat him by the kitchen doors like a beggar, was a fraud in the truest sense. A thief dressed in a tailored suit, a coward hiding behind the Palmer's name. The investigator leaned back, his voice steady, but edged with unease. He's been covering tracks for years. Family money has bailed him out more than once, but it's worse now. He's desperate. One wrong bet, and the whole facade collapses. He tapped the folder with a single finger. "You hold that wrong bet right there." The father closed the file slowly, his eyes dark and unblinking. He saw the entire picture now, not just the polished arrogance, but the desperation behind it. The disdain, the contempt. It wasn't strength. It was fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of losing the empire built on lies. And fear is the most dangerous weakness of all. He walked out of the office with the folder under his arm, the city night pressing heavy around him. Streetlights flickered overhead, cars hissed through the rain-slick streets, and he felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The humiliation he had endured at that wedding, the sting of being erased, no longer cut him. It was fuel now, pure and clean. They thought they had silenced him, but they had only given him the perfect weapon. At home, he spread the documents across his kitchen table, the same table where his wife once set down plates of food after long days, the same table where his son had done homework under her watchful eye. He traced the numbers with a calloused finger, each line of theft another nail in the fiancé's coffin. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had called him unrefined, dismissed him as just in construction, but here he was holding the blueprint to dismantle everything they thought untouchable. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light, and let the silence settle heavy in the room. He thought of his wife, of the fury she would have felt at seeing their son entangled with a man like this. He thought of his brother mocked for not being established when it was the fiancé who built his life on stolen ground. He thought of the Palmers so obsessed with appearances, blind to the rot festering under their roof. And then he thought of his son, caught between love and lies, too blind to see the chains being slipped around his wrists. The father leaned back, the glass warm in his hand, and smiled faintly. Not the smile of amusement, but of inevitability. They believed they had buried him in humiliation, but they had buried themselves instead. He had the truth now, and truth was heavier than any weapon. It didn't need to shout. It simply waited for the right moment to fall. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, streaking the windows, drumming against the roof. He listened to it, steady and relentless, and felt the rhythm match the beat of his own heart. The Palmers thought their legacy was permanent, but permanence is a lie. Every empire crumbles, every mask slips, every secret surfaces. And when it did, he would be the one standing there, calm and steady, while their world collapsed in ruins. He gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and set it neatly on the table. His decision was made. The boy's fate was no longer in question. The only question that remained was how and when the truth would be revealed. And when it was, it wouldn't just destroy the fiancé. It would scorch the entire family, leaving nothing but ashes of their arrogance. The father turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room in darkness, and walked down the hall. The storm outside roared louder. But inside, he was still silent, resolved. The reckoning was no longer coming. It had already begun. The recording came by accident, the kind of slip arrogance always makes when it thinks no one is listening. The father had given his investigator time and space, never pressing, knowing that real rot always revealed itself if you were patient enough. One evening, the investigator called, his voice steady but carrying the weight of revelation. "You should hear this yourself," he said. And within the hour, the father sat alone in his truck, parked under the shadows of an old oak, the flash drive cold in his hand. He slotted it into the player, and the cabin filled with the fiancé's voice, smooth and dripping with contempt. "His people aren't the kind we want. Look at them construction crews, neighbors' women who probably clip coupons. They don't belong at a wedding like this. Important people need to feel important, and his circle is just noise. Let him pout if he wants, he'll pay for it anyway. That's his role, funding the show, not starring in it." The words were sharp-coated in smug laughter, punctuated by the faint clink of ice in a glass. The father sat motionless, listening as the boy's arrogance poured from the speakers like poison. He heard more than disdain. He heard the truth of how deeply they had plotted his humiliation. The fiancé's confidence was absolute, certain that the old man was powerless, that loyalty and sacrifice could be dismissed with a sneer. The recording continued, more careless barbs, more evidence of the rot beneath the polished smile. "He doesn't understand the circles he's in now. He thinks respect comes from hard work, from showing up. That's small-minded. Respect comes from power, from money that stays clean, from names that matter. His friends, his family, they drag down the image. We don't need them. We don't need him except for his wallet." The father's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but his face remained calm, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside the windshield. There was no need to rage, no need to curse. Rage was a waste of energy. This wasn't an insult. It was a weapon, gift-wrapped and placed in his hands by the boy himself. He let the recording play again, memorizing every inflection, every sneer, until the words etched themselves into his bones. When the file ended, the silence inside the truck was heavy but not empty. It was full of certainty. The father knew arrogance always left a trail, but this was more than a trail. This was fire waiting for a spark. He slipped the drive back into his pocket and exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the window. They had thought they erased him, made him invisible, but now he held the power to erase them instead. He drove home through quiet streets, headlights cutting through the night, the hum of the engine steady beneath him. He remembered the men who had been cut from the guest list, the work crews, the neighbors, the lifelong friends who had stood by him through storms and hunger and loss. He thought of their faces, the laughter they had shared, the loyalty they had given freely. And now to hear them reduced to noise, too unimportant, lit a fire in him hotter than any insult ever could. At home, he poured a drink and set the flash drive on the kitchen table beside the folder of debts and embezzlement. Two pieces of evidence, each damning on its own, now fused into a weapon sharp enough to cut through any facade. He studied them in the low light, the amber liquid glowing in his glass, and for the first time in weeks he felt something close to satisfaction. They had underestimated him, and that was their fatal mistake. He could already imagine the fallout. The recording leaked at the right time, played in the right ears, would shatter the illusion of refinement the Palmers had spent decades crafting. Guests who had toasted the couple would recoil. Business partners who prided themselves on appearances would scatter. And his son, his blinded, hesitant son, would finally hear the truth, not from his father's lips, but from the mouth of the man he thought he loved. The father leaned back in his chair, the house silent around him, the storm outside pressing against the windows. He replayed the boy's voice in his mind, sneering, arrogant, certain of victory. He let the words sink deeper, let them burn until they no longer hurt but hardened. This wasn't just proof. This was a blade, and he would decide when and how to strike. Timing was everything. The following day he walked through his neighborhood, the same streets where he had built his life, where neighbors waved from porches and old friends stopped to ask about his health. He thought of how easily they had been dismissed as unworthy, how arrogance had tried to erase them. He shook hands, smiled, and carried their loyalty like armor. They were more than names on a cut list. They were the foundation of his life. And when the truth came out, the contrast between their quiet dignity and the Palmers' corruption would be impossible to ignore. That night he called the investigator again. "Keep digging," he said simply. The man agreed, his tone heavy with respect. The father hung up and looked at the flash drive one more time. This wasn't the end. This was only a beginning, a carefully staged opening move. He understood now with perfect clarity, arrogance is always loudest before it breaks. And when it breaks, it doesn't shatter quietly. It explodes, taking down everything built on top of it. The father turned off the lights and stood in the darkness, the recording still echoing in his ears, the contempt sharp and unmistakable. He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with certainty. The boy's voice, once meant to diminish him, had become the very noose tightening around his own neck. And soon the whole world would hear it. The conversation came late at night, long after the glitter of the wedding had faded and the house had gone quiet. The father had waited, knowing timing mattered more than anger, and now his son sat across from him at the kitchen table where so many decisions had been made. The same table where homework had been done under his wife's watchful eyes, where bills had been sorted when money was thin, where birthdays had been celebrated with store-bought cake and laughter that filled the walls. The son's face was pale, his hands restless, his eyes shifting as if searching for a safe corner to land on. He carried himself differently now, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched, the polish of the Palmers' world already pressing into him like a vice. The father poured 2 glasses of water, pushing one across the table without a word. The silence was heavy but not hostile, thick with truths neither had spoken. Finally the son cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Dad, it's complicated. You don't understand how they are what they expect. If I don't fit in, if I don't play their game, everything falls apart." He looked down at his hands, ashamed of the words even as he said them. "I love her. I have to do this." The father studied him quietly, the lines on his face deepened by the low light. He didn't respond with anger. He didn't mock or dismiss. Instead, his voice was calm, steady, the voice that had guided the boy through storms as a child. "Son, true love doesn't erase who you are. It doesn't demand you bury your family, your friends, your history. If it asks that, it isn't love. It's control dressed up in flowers and fancy words." The son winced, his eyes flashing with something between defiance and guilt. "It's not like that," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it. "They just want things to be right, refined." He stumbled over the words, echoing the Palmers' language without realizing it. "They're giving me a chance at something bigger." The father leaned forward, his gaze sharp but not cruel. "Bigger than what?" "Bigger than the life your mother and I built from nothing. Bigger than the nights I worked 2 jobs to keep the roof over your head. Bigger than the people who stood by us when we had nothing but hope and grit." His voice cut like a blade, not raised but edged with truth. "Son, if bigger means forgetting where you came from, it's not bigger, it's emptier." The boy's throat tightened. his eyes glossy, but pride kept him from breaking. He wanted so badly to believe that marrying into wealth meant stability, security, a shortcut to a future free of struggle. But his father's words stripped that illusion bare, exposing the fragile scaffolding beneath. He shifted in his chair, restless, his knuckles white against the glass of water he hadn't touched. The father softened slightly his tone, turning from steel to something gentler, the way he used to speak when patching up skinned knees, or explaining why the world was unfair but survivable. "I'm not against love, son. I want you to be happy. But happiness built on pretending your past doesn't exist never lasts. One day you'll look in the mirror and not recognize the man staring back. And worse, you'll realize the people who loved you for who you truly are gone, pushed aside so you could sit at someone else's table." The son swallowed hard, the weight of the truth pressing against his chest. "I just don't want to lose her," he whispered. The father nodded slowly, his eyes steady. "Then ask yourself this. Why does being with her mean losing yourself? Why does it mean losing us? Real love doesn't put you at war with your own blood. It doesn't force you to choose between your heart and your history." The words settled in the silence, heavy and undeniable. The son looked away, blinking rapidly, his jaw trembling as he fought back the emotion clawing at him. He wanted to defend her, wanted to defend the family he was marrying into, but the words caught in his throat because deep down he knew his father was right. He had felt the shame at the wedding, had seen the disdain in their eyes, had heard the whispers about his background. He knew he was being reshaped, molded into something that wasn't his own. And now, facing his father, the weight of that transformation felt suffocating. The father let the silence stretch, not pressing, not demanding. He had planted the truth, and truth never needed shouting. It only needed time to grow. He stood finally, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, the gesture firm but not forceful. "Think about it," he said quietly, "because one day soon you'll have to decide what matters more. Love that lifts you up or love that chains you down." The son nodded stiffly, unable to meet his father's eyes, his chest tight with conflict. He wanted to speak, to explain, but the words refused to come. The father left him there at the table alone with his thoughts, the ticking of the clock filling the room like a countdown. Upstairs, the father paused by the photograph of his wife on the mantel. Her eyes seemed to burn through the frame, fierce and unyielding, and he felt her presence like a whisper urging him forward. He knew his son was trapped, blinded by the illusion of wealth and acceptance, but he also knew illusions always shatter. And when they did, the truth would be impossible to ignore. As he turned off the lights, the father's face was calm, but his mind was already sharpening the next step. The boy could not see the chains he was wearing, but chains break loudest when they're stretched too far. And very soon the sound of breaking would echo through every gilded hall the Palmers thought they owned. The reckoning began not with shouting or slammed doors, but with a series of quiet phone calls placed from the father's study in the dim light of dawn. He sat at his desk, the same scarred oak desk, where bills had once been paid penny by penny, where late-night planning had saved his business more than once. His fingers moved deliberately across the buttons of the phone, his voice steady, controlled, almost cordial. He didn't need threats. He didn't need to explain. The weight of his name, built over decades of loyalty and honest work, was enough. The florist was first. He spoke to the owner, an old friend he had known since the days when they were both struggling to keep their doors open. One request spoken plainly, and the arrangements for the reception vanished like mist. No roses, no lilies, no centerpieces to photograph. Just bare tables waiting to expose the emptiness beneath the polish. Next was the caterer, a man who had once been a dishwasher in one of the father's projects, whom he had recommended for his first major contract years ago. Gratitude doesn't fade easily, and when the father's voice carried through the line, the caterer listened. Within hours, the lavish menu collapsed. The kitchens went cold, deliveries halted mid-route. Guests would sit before plates that never arrived, their champagne flutes empty, their forks tapping against silence. The band was easier still. He had helped their manager's brother secure financing for a club long ago, a favor never forgotten. One call, one pause of recognition, and the music dissolved. No first dance, no triumphant entrance, no rhythm to hide the whispers when the truth began to spread. By midday, the wedding that had cost $100,000 on paper was nothing more than a hollow shell. The Palmers, still drunk on their illusion of control, hadn't realized yet that the stage they were standing on had been pulled apart piece by piece. It was an invisible demolition executed with precision, not a brick left standing. The father leaned back in his chair, the silence of the room wrapping around him like armor. He thought of his wife, of the pride she would have felt to see him take back his dignity without raising his voice, without staining his hands. He thought of his brother, mocked for being a doctor who had saved countless lives, and smiled faintly at the thought of justice arriving in silence. When the first calls of panic began, venues asking for alternative payments, vendors announcing cancellations, the Palmers scrambled. The fiancé raged, his voice rising in shrill disbelief as he barked orders into his phone. But arrogance cannot rebuild what it never respected. No amount of shouting could resurrect flowers already disposed of, meals already rerouted, musicians already gone. He learned hour by hour what it meant to be powerless. The father, meanwhile, walked through his neighborhood, greeting friends with nods, shaking hands with men who still remembered the days when he had fought to keep roofs over their heads. He carried himself with quiet calm, no sign of the storm he had unleashed. To the world, he was simply a man taking his morning walk. To those who had wronged him, he was the architect of collapse. That evening, as the Palmers sat in their mansion surrounded by chaos, the father received a call from the fiancé himself. The boy's voice, usually dripping with smug superiority, cracked under the weight of desperation. "What did you do?" he demanded, fury thinly masking fear. The father said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then, in a voice calm and deliberate, he answered, "I didn't do anything you didn't bring on yourself." The line went quiet. The boy sputtered, cursed, threatened lawsuits, but the father's patience was unshakable. He ended the call with a simple statement. "You thought I was unimportant. Today you learned otherwise." He set the phone down and stared out the window at the fading light, the world outside moving as if nothing had changed. But he knew everything had changed. The Palmers' empire of appearances had been gutted in a single day, undone not by force but by the quiet power of respect and loyalty they could never buy. His son arrived later, his face pale, his eyes wide with confusion. He demanded explanations, asked how it had all unraveled so quickly. The father listened, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, this is what happens when you build your future on lies. It only takes one truth to bring it crashing down." The boy wanted to argue, wanted to defend the woman he loved, but the words caught in his throat. He had seen the cancellations, heard the panic, felt the ground shift beneath him. He knew deep down that his father's quiet warning had been right all along. The father said no more. He didn't need to. He had struck his blow, and the reverberations would echo long after the dust settled. He walked to the mantel where his wife's photograph waited, touched the edge of the frame gently, and whispered to the silence, "For you." Outside, the night deepened, shadows stretching across the street, and the father stood steady in the quiet. He had dismantled the spectacle with calm precision, left arrogance stripped bare before the world. And yet in his eyes there was no gloating, no triumph, only resolve. Because this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a reckoning that would cut deeper than any canceled wedding. The Palmers thought they had written him out of the story. They were about to discover that he was the one holding the pen. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The father sat at the kitchen table, the same place where he had laid out his arsenal of truth, the folder of debts and stolen funds, the flash drive with the recording of the fiancé's sneering contempt, and the notes from every phone call that had quietly unraveled a $100,000 spectacle. The pieces lay before him like weapons polished and waiting. He no longer felt the sting of humiliation. That had burned off like fog under the sun. What remained was sharper, cleaner, the cold certainty of a man who had been underestimated for far too long. He lit a single lamp, its glow catching the edges of the papers, and leaned back studying them as though they were blueprints for a structure only he could see. That was what it was in truth, a demolition plan, one built not of concrete and steel, but of pride, greed, and arrogance. He didn't need to raise his voice or pound his fist. He had already spoken the only language men like the Palmers understood, the quiet withdrawal of power. They had thought him irrelevant, just another figure to bankroll their illusions. Now they were learning the truth. The phone rang twice that night, desperate calls from the fiancé, his voice cracking with rage and fear. The father didn't answer. Silence was a better reply than any words. Let the boy stew. Let him feel the absence of control for the first time in his life. Every hour that passed without an answer was another nail hammered into the coffin of his arrogance. At dawn, the father walked outside, the morning air crisp against his skin. Neighbors waved their greetings, warm, grounding him in the world that mattered. He thought of the men who had stood by him when times were lean, the friends who had carried him through grief, the family bonds that had been mocked and dismissed by the Palmers as unimportant. These were his people, the ones who had given him respect without asking for credentials, who had valued him not for his wallet, but for his word. These were the truly important people, and soon the fiancé would learn what that meant. As the day stretched on, he made calls not to vendors this time, but to allies, men and women whose respect had been earned across decades of sweat and integrity. Some owed him favors, others simply trusted him, and all of them listened when he spoke. He didn't reveal everything. He only planted seeds, shared glimpses of the truth. Word traveled fast in circles that pretended to prize discretion. By the time the sun set, whispers of embezzlement and gambling debts had already begun to ripple outward, staining the pristine surface of the Palmers' reputation. He returned home that evening and stood before his wife's photograph, the glass catching the fading light. He thought of how fiercely she had defended their family, how quickly she would have cut through the pretense and lies. "We're not finished yet," he murmured, his voice steady. "But he'll know soon enough. They all will." Later, as darkness cloaked the streets, he sat again at the table, his tools of justice laid neatly in front of him. The humiliation of being shoved by the kitchen doors at his own son's wedding was gone, replaced by a calm resolve that pulsed in his veins. He could almost hear the fiancé's voice again, mocking him, dismissing his friends, calling them unimportant. The father smiled faintly. That arrogance captured forever on the recording would be the spark that ignited everything. The power had shifted, though the Palmers hadn't realized it yet. They still clung to their illusions, still believed that their money and their name insulated them from consequence. But the father knew better. He had built enough structures to understand how fragile appearances were, how quickly the strongest-looking walls could collapse if the foundation was rotten. And this foundation was rotten to its core. He rose from his chair, pacing slowly through the house, each step measured, deliberate. His son's face flickered in his mind, conflicted, ashamed, torn between love and truth. That battle wasn't over. The boy would have to make his choice, and the father knew the truth would force him to see what his heart already suspected. The fiancé's downfall would not just be a public spectacle. It would be a revelation, one that exposed what love was supposed to be and what it should never become. At midnight, he returned to his desk and packed everything into a single briefcase, the files, the recording, the notes. He closed it with a click that echoed in the quiet room. This was not the sound of anger. It was the sound of inevitability. Tomorrow or the next day, the boy who thought himself untouchable would be confronted with reality. And when that happened, the father would not need to shout. He would only need to open the briefcase and let the truth speak for itself. He turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness, and walked down the hall. The clock ticked steadily, each sound a reminder that time was running out for the Palmers' golden facade. In the silence, the father's resolve was absolute. The reckoning wasn't coming someday far off. It was here, coiled tight and ready, waiting only for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment arrived, the arrogant fiancé would finally learn who the important people really were and why they had never been him. Life has a way of revealing the truth no matter how carefully arrogance tries to hide it. In this story, a father who was dismissed, humiliated, and pushed aside found strength not in shouting but in patience, dignity, and the quiet power of loyalty. The lesson is clear. True worth is not measured by money, last names, or polished appearances. It is measured by the lives we've touched, the sacrifices we've made, and the respect we've earned through integrity. For older generations, it is a reminder that the years of hard work and love poured into family cannot be erased by anyone's arrogance. And for the younger, it is a warning. Love and loyalty should never demand that you abandon your roots or forget where you came from. In the end, those who chase status may crumble, but those who hold fast to truth and dignity endure. If this message resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story of betrayal, justice, and the strength that comes with age.